My name is Jennifer J. Raffler, and I am your host for the Sol2Soul Global Summit 2. Learn the truth about our sun, how it heals us, supports our spiritual evolution, and more. Today we have a most beautiful guest, Lara Atwood. Lara Atwood is a practitioner of the ancient religion of the sun, and most specifically, the Indo-European branch of it, which is her own native tradition. She believes the religion of the sun is one of the most ancient religions in the world and is the origin of many spiritual traditions and sacred sites around the globe. She and her husband first came across evidence for the religion of the sun while researching and writing their book called The Path of the Spiritual Sun, which they began working on in 2011. By combining her research with her husband's spiritual experience, they were able to uncover the deeper meanings and practice of this religion, which had become lost over time, as well as the story of its origins and history. Lara now presents this on the YouTube channel called Sol2Soul and website of the same name. The name Sol2Soul means sacred sun in the ancient Proto-Indo-European language. Hi, Lara, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be with you, Jennifer.
It's nice to have you here. I'm so grateful to have your presence. Could you explain for our viewers what is a solstice and what is an equinox?
Sure. Okay, so there are 4 solstices and equinoxes, 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes. So we have the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year, and it's the time of least light and greatest darkness. On the opposite end of the extreme, we have the summer solstice, which is the longest day of the year, and that's the time of greatest light and least darkness. In between each of these solstices is a crossing point, which is the equinox. So when we're going from winter solstice to summer solstice, we have the spring equinox. And this is when light and darkness, or the hours of night and day, are exactly equal. But from the spring equinox onwards, light is going to increase, so the days become longer than the nights. When we go from the summer solstice to the winter solstice, we again have a crossing point where light and darkness are exactly equal. But this time, the nights are actually going to be longer than the days, so darkness prevails. And so what we have with the solstices and equinoxes are the major turning points in the seasons and the sort of extremes of light and darkness. And these held a special spiritual meaning to certain ancient peoples.
Okay, so what did the light represent?
So the light represents everything that is spiritual. So if you think about light and what that might mean, it means the light in the universe and that force of growth, but also the light within us. So ancient peoples or ancient practitioners of the religion of the sun saw light not just in a physical sense, but also as having spiritual properties and qualities and being related to the light that we have within, to the light of consciousness, and also to our higher consciousness, to our inner being or higher being.
Okay, so then the dark would be the lack of that light?
Exactly, that's right. And so if you think of light and consciousness and what is spiritual and all of its qualities, so love and inner peace and wisdom, happiness, just imagine the exact opposite of that, which is the lack of those qualities, and that's the darkness.
For the fall equinox that's coming up on September 22nd, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, we are going to increase darkness moving forward until we get
That's right.
winter solstice. So
that's right.
Okay. So what does that mean symbolically or spiritually for us in regards to the sun and in regards to our soul?
So basically, what the path of the sun throughout the year, so it essentially makes the journey. Really, it's the Earth's journey around the sun, but in terms of light and darkness, there's a journey that the sun makes, and we actually call that the path of the spiritual sun, which is the title of the book. Ancient people actually spoke about this path of the sun. So in the ancient Vedic tradition, for example, which was preserved in India, they talk about a path of the sun. And this path of the sun was understood to actually represent a path to enlightenment. And the different solstices and equinoxes actually represent those stages on that path. And the reason that path is mirrored in the heavens is because creation itself contains principles. I think you've probably heard of the ancient saying, as above, so below. Yeah. And so there are principles that operate on the greatest of scales, you could say at the macrocosmic level, but also on the smallest of scales at the microcosmic. And so the journey of the sun and light and darkness in the heavens is actually intimately related to our own spiritual journey, our own psyche, or a journey that we can take as consciousness through the polarity of light and darkness in creation. And although darkness is often sort of feared, and the time of the autumn equinox might seem like a dark time, which it is, darkness actually has a role in this path. Darkness has a role in creation, and it provides opposition to light. And so it's through knowing or through having darkness that we even know that light exists. So the autumn equinox to ancient people was not a time of evil or anything like that. It was seen as a time of descent into this darkness, but a descent that is not just external, that the sun is descending, but the person descends into darkness in order to actually learn and extract the light. So at the winter solstice, most people would have actually celebrated the winter solstice and may not realize it, because the time of winter solstice corresponds to Christmas. And so Christmas is the birth of the light, the birth of the spiritual sun. And the autumn equinox is the time that precedes that, where someone prepares for the birth of the spiritual sun within themselves, ultimately. So ancient people actually celebrated this, the autumn equinox. They aligned many of their ancient sites to it. And one of the biggest autumn equinox celebrations in the world is actually held in India. So it's a festival of Durga Puja, which celebrates the divine mother goddess. And she has a very special role in learning about ourselves and descending into the darkness of our own subconscious, into our own psyche, to extract light. So she has a special role in actually helping us to learn and to extract that light, which was why she was celebrated at this time of year, and she still is, by I think at least tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people today in India.
Is there a corresponding god or goddess in other parts of the globe?
Yeah, so the goddess Durga in India, she's depicted as a warrior. So she's depicted riding a tiger or a lion and armed with various weapons. And she's actually understood in India very clearly as being the destroyer of ego. So the destroyer of our own ego. Yeah, so, our various angers and hatreds and envies, our sort of anxieties and fears and so on. She's the one who's petitioned to actually destroy those egos. And so there are beautiful songs in India, actually, traditional folk songs, which talk about her role as the slayer of ego and as ultimately our inner protector, And so she has different parallels around the world in different cultures. Incredibly, the depiction of Durga or her counterpart Kali, so she has like a more sort of ferocious aspect called Kali, who's depicted somewhat similarly, and as well as understood as the slayer of ego. She's depicted almost identically to Coatlicue in the Aztec tradition in Mesoamerica. And then there are divine warrior goddesses in different parts of the world, like in Sumeria she was known as Inanna. And Athena in Greece, these goddesses were depicted as warriors and as protectors. Her role probably is most clearly preserved in India because that's where the tradition was sort of kept alive continuously, and a lot of the texts were preserved, where in other parts of the world things were lost.
Okay. So for each of the equinoxes and the solstices, are there different goddesses and gods that are venerated?
So each has a different spiritual meaning, because each embodies a certain spiritual principle, because at the summer solstice, for example, it's the greatest light. So this is the time of enlightenment, whereas at the winter solstice, it's the time of greatest darkness. But it's when the sun appears at its weakest. So it's like almost like a little baby being born. The light is just kind of coming into the darkness, into the world for the first time. This is how ancient people understood it and depicted it symbolically as like a little child. And that's why you have the birth of Jesus at Christmas, who was representing this spiritual sun. So each of these different times of year have specific meanings. And in terms of gods and goddesses, these were often not seen as outside entities or beings, but as representing certain principles. So, for example, Durga represents an inner part of our own being that each one has, this sort of divine mother, this sort of higher feminine aspect of each person's being, which is petitioned to destroy ego. So each of the different solstices and equinoxes, like I said, represent like a stage on this path of the spiritual sun. And so they have different meanings. And so ancient peoples celebrated them in different ways according to their meaning.
What happens at the spring equinox? Is that a rebirth?
Yeah, so the spring equinox is a very interesting time because you have basically where light and darkness are equal. And so again, in India, what you have is I don't know, people may not have heard of this, the churning of the Milky Ocean. So this was depicted at the ancient site of Angkor Wat and aligned to the spring equinox sunrise. So a lot of these solstices and equinoxes were incorporated into many, many different ancient sites around the world. So some of the most famous ones have alignments to the solstice or equinox. And ancient peoples often align their sites using different symbols, different spiritual symbols, which reveal the meaning that these events have and the meaning they understood them to have. So the churning of the Milky Ocean is one such symbol that was aligned to the spring equinox sunrise at an ancient site, Angkor Wat in Cambodia. And it symbolizes the forces of light on one hand in a tug of war against the forces of darkness. And at the spring equinox, there's a kind of an opposition between light and darkness, and which one will actually prevail within somebody. And at the spring equinox, the forces of light prevail after this struggle. And so this was symbolized in different ancient teachings as well as you have Easter, for example. in the life of Jesus, which is the time of his passion and crucifixion. And this crucifixion is also found in the life of Odin or Wotan in the Norse and Germanic tradition. And so this is a time where there is an inner death. Someone must die, not physically, but inwardly, to their own false self, to their own lower self and their own image of their self, to be able to overcome the darkness and resurrect and reunite with their higher being. So there's this kind of struggle between the forces of light and darkness within ourselves, and we need to overcome the inner darkness. So this is, the ancient people symbolized this in different ancient sites and in different ancient mythologies and ancient texts.
Okay. And what about Stonehenge? How is that aligned? Is that for one of the solstices or one of the equinoxes or all of the above?
Okay, well, Stonehenge is actually, it's an incredible site. It has lots of different alignments, and it was used over a period of many thousands of years. But its most dominant alignment is to the summer solstice. And it has alignments at the summer solstice sunrise, at midday and sunset. And I believe archaeological evidence has found that it was most used at the time of the summer solstice. So you have Stonehenge, but then you also have other sites that people may not realize are aligned to the solstices and equinoxes, like the Great Pyramids and Sphinx of Egypt. So the Sphinx actually stares directly at the equinox sunrise, and even the pyramids align to different solstices and equinoxes. So they're passageways, sometimes there are shadows and all sorts of amazing things that were incorporated into the pyramids. A lot of people aren't familiar with that. Then you also have the stone statues on Easter Island called the Moai. So they're very famous. A number of those aligned to the summer solstice sunset and also to the equinox sunset. You also have Machu Picchu in Peru. There's a temple of the sun there. So that aligns to winter solstice sunrise. And hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of ancient sites throughout the world incorporated these alignments to the solstices and equinoxes. And that's very interesting because they didn't have to. And these sites are some of the most enigmatic, sacred and advanced sites. Some of them we still don't know how the people built them. You know, they're made of such huge blocks and with such precision. So it's amazing that their most dominant alignments are actually to the solstices and equinoxes. And they're sacred sites. So people who built them and who used them obviously saw those times of years as not only important, but important in a spiritual and sacred sense, and enough to actually incorporate them into their sacred spaces. I think ancient people understood is that nature itself and creation is actually imbued with certain principles. And like I said, these operate not only above and below, so you have the fractal nature of creation. So they also operate both outside and within us. So the natural world actually is imbued with all these principles. And ancient people then saw matter not as just a kind of a dead thing and things that have just happened randomly, but actually alive and as full of great teaching and wisdom. You know, to be able to understand creation means that we can understand ourselves because it's all intertwined. And so it was very important then, the sun and stars and the heavens and so on contain these principles that actually relate to us, like I said, to us within ourselves and to our own inward journey through creation and also to enlightenment. And so by incorporating these alignments, incorporating the movements of the sun and the stars, they were actually incorporating certain principles into the design of these sites so that they became places connected through creation, and expressing and containing these principles that were very important, particularly to the process of enlightenment.
Okay. So the ancient peoples were much more wise than we are.
In a nutshell, yes. So I guess this is the thing, because we have a lot of access to information today which can help us understand and know about things intellectually. But there's also a lot to be said for experiencing something yourself. So that's why there are ceremonies in the book, for example, because people can actually experience what it is to have your own little sacred space or whatever you can put together, and to celebrate the solstice and equinox, understanding its spiritual meaning, and to perhaps even try and align something to, let's say, the solstice or equinox, and to experience the power of that and what it actually feels like, and to be connected to what many ancient people were actually doing.
I understand that you traveled to a lot of these spots. Was there anyone in particular that really stood out to you? What is your favorite spot?
Well, I went to the Great Pyramids a number of years ago, and when I got out at the airport in Cairo, somehow I couldn't see the pyramids, but I could just feel them. I could just feel it. I didn't expect that. I wasn't thinking about it. And I found the pyramids to just be amazing, even though when I saw them, the site was obviously, its glory days were gone, and, it looks, pretty tatty, and the outer casing of the pyramids, for example, has been removed, and a lot of things are quite weathered. But the actual power of the site really just took me aback. So this is the thing, people, when they use a site, they imbue it with energy. So if ancient people were using a site for sacred ceremonies, and it was used perhaps over a long period of time, and they were doing like genuinely spiritual practices, they're sort of imbuing it with an energy. And it seems like that energy really lingers. It gets sort of imbued into a place, so that even perhaps hundreds or thousands of years later, it still has a sort of a power to it, and it can kind of communicate on that kind of energetic level to you of what sort of happened there. So again, people can do this again today to create sacred sites. It's not just something that was only possible in the past. It is possible to do it again if people understand the principles that they're working with, and to create a sacred space, and to again imbue it with energy through using it for spiritual practice and ceremonies with the right principles.
Yeah, the intention.
That's right.
So why did so many ancient civilizations venerate the sun throughout the entire globe? Not just in one area, but it seems like all around the globe.
That's right. It's actually an amazing topic. And it's surprising that people don't know more about it, because it was so widespread. It was really, I would say, the dominant religion of the ancient world. And the story of the veneration of the sun is an incredible one. It actually begins, we've traced it through our research as much as we can, and it begins at least many thousands of years ago, I believe at the end of the last ice age. it was actually seeded after the end of the last ice age. There's a lot of talk now about a disaster that ended the last ice age, some kind of worldwide cataclysm.
Mm-hmm.
And it really set humanity back. You know, civilization was lost, and people were living a very subsistence kind of lifestyle. But there are records in many different ancient indigenous traditions of these wisdom bringers, these great sages turning up and appearing to them and coming on a special mission to them to teach them the ancient religion of the sun and the arts of civilization. And this is consistent in many different parts of the world. You have the same legends in ancient Egypt, in ancient India, in Easter Island, even in North America, and in Central and South America, and many other parts of the world. And so a lot of people, when they think about ancient sun worship, they think about people just worshipped the sun because, you know, it's kind of there, and it helps their crops to grow, and it's a very important part of natural living and life and so on, which it is. But actually the story is much deeper than that, that there was an ancient religion that was taken to people in which the sun was the supreme form of divinity. And it's because it's a supreme form of light and life. Without the sun, there is no life whatsoever. And it's a greater source of light. You know, it's a star. So the sun and stars are the greatest form of light in the universe. And so these ancient people understood it not as a sort of profane kind of symbol, just helping crops to grow and so on, but as a very deeply spiritual symbol, as the sun embodying these spiritual principles. And this was actually, this knowledge was brought to ancient people at a specific time in history. And it got remembered in many different traditions preserved by indigenous people around the world, and became their religion. And that's why a lot of their ancient religions share many similarities with one another. Most obviously, their ancient veneration of the sun.
Who were these wisdom bringers? Were these galactic beings? Where did they come from?
Well, it might surprise you that their names will be familiar to you. One of them was Osiris.
Okay.
Then you also have Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan in Central America. You also have Viracocha in South America. You have Manu in India. So these names are often very familiar to people because they're such huge figures in world mythology, but they've become remembered purely as gods, as if they were never human beings. But actually, if you research into these figures and the traditions around them, you discover that ancient people who spoke about these figures spoke about them as very real people who appeared to them, to their ancient ancestors at a period of time, and taught them their ancient religion. So, for example, Osiris, even the Egyptologist Wallace Budge, who's very, very famous for his work in Egyptology, talks very much about Osiris as having been a real person, and it's not just an isolated case. You know, in South America, the ancient ancestors of the Incas, when the Spanish arrived, actually told their conquerors that Viracocha had been a real person who had visited them in a very ancient time. And these wisdom bringers are described in incredibly similar ways. So sometimes they even have the same name on different continents, which is quite incredible. So, for example, in Norse and Germanic tradition, you have Wotan or Vuotan, and in Central America, you also have a wisdom bringer called Vuotan, and they have many similarities. They're often described as men with long flowing beards, long flowing robes, often holding a staff, with blue eyes, and they're described in incredibly and depicted in incredibly similar ways as turning up in boats with helpers. So a number of different sages who came to help them in their mission, and they actually traveled the world specifically to try and teach people and help them. So
that's amazing. So it's possible that it's the same being in all the...
That's right. In many of the different traditions, it's possible that it was actually the same, either the same person or same group of people who traveled at the same time.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, so all of a sudden Osiris is not a sort of very distant figure. He was a real living, breathing person.
And travel back then wasn't like travel right now. I
Today.
mean, I didn't just hop on the plane and, you know,
no,
the airport in Mexico. No.
Exactly. So this was, I think it's one of the most incredible stories of human and ancient history, that these people risked their lives. They traveled, in legends it says they traveled on reed boats, and these reed boats incredibly are usually depicted in very similar ways as carrying the sun. So they were described as sun ships, and the symbol of the sun ship again is preserved in different ancient cultures. So it shows how important the sun was as a symbol in the ancient religion they took everywhere. And they would have had to travel across oceans and different continents taking this message. And there's a lot of evidence to say that this was actually possible in ancient times. People like this could have traveled the oceans. There's the work of Thor Heyerdahl, and he famously built a reed boat based on ancient designs in ancient Egypt and in Peru to actually prove that it was possible that ancient people could have traveled using these ancient reed ships from one continent to another. So he actually did it himself in 1947, and his film won an Oscar. So it's actually been proven that ancient people could have traveled this way. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So these wisdom bringers, this group of people, were they alive at the time before the flood?
It seems like it. That's what a lot of the ancient traditions say, that they were alive before the flood and then they were forewarned. So very similar stories and mythologies around the flood, as you're probably aware. And so they're forewarned that a flood is coming, and that usually they sort of construct a boat or get to safety. And then it's after the flood, then they appear again, teaching people and trying to help rebuild civilization.
Immediately after the flood, we weren't one continent, correct? We were individual continents at that point, just to clarify?
I think so, yes.
Okay. That just makes it even more amazing, right? And
yeah, that's right.
And for this group of people to be able to communicate in the various languages, it almost makes me think there is a little bit of mental telepathy going on.
Well, it's interesting because these wisdom bringers are described as having some supernatural abilities. So they are described in the South American legends as being able to speak or understand different languages, and many other things, like bring people back to life. Some of them were known as great healers, and even as being able to draw fire out of the air if they really needed to in order to protect themselves. So yeah, these were very very advanced individuals, you know, with which I believe had a special spiritual mission in terms of our human history and civilization.
Thank you for that, Lara. It's the first I've heard of this in all my research, so that's just amazing.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. That's right. Not many people have heard about this. So yeah, it's just such an incredible story. And look, there's a lot more, because you have what happened before the wisdom bringers, which is perhaps people are more familiar with, which is the sort of lost civilization that was destroyed in the flood, which they again have connections to. And then you have what happens after the wisdom bringers, which is this kind of explosion of the ancient religion of the sun, where people all over the world are building these incredible structures and sites, these sacred places aligned to the sun, and down over many thousands of years. So many of the sites that we're familiar with are part of this ancient legacy. So when I started out, and Mark and I started out researching this, we thought that all these different sites were largely disconnected from one another. You know, they didn't have any relationship to one another, people kind of just separately doing their own thing. But now I understand that a lot of these sites were actually part of the same culture, the same religion, and the same legacy left behind by this great teaching, this great mission.
And for the pyramids, do you believe that it was slaves that built the pyramids, or do you think it was another type of technology? Have you picked up on any of that through your research?
Oh, the pyramids are such a mystery. What I have read about them is that I've seen no indication that they were built by slaves. I have seen indication that they were probably built and renovated over a long period of time. So what you find with a lot of these ancient sites is that they weren't just kind of built and then left, but you have like a kind of a layering. So often these places were held as sacred, possibly thousands of years ago, if not tens of thousands of years ago. So ancient people would keep building upon these sacred places. So, for example, in Central America, what they're finding with a lot of the pyramids there is that there are at least sometimes 5 layers of renovation, and the most ancient structure is the one right at the core. And so then successive cultures and people who inhabited the site still recognized it as a very sacred place and just kept renovating it. And so there's evidence to show in ancient Egypt that this happened too, and that some of the core structures of some of the ancient sites and pyramids may be very, very old, and then later pharaohs or dynasties in Egypt undertook renovation projects over these ancient sites. So I think that's where some of the kind of confusion with dating and so on comes in.
Because it's layered.
It's layered in so many instances. It's layered, and if, funnily enough, then you have in Britain sometimes you have an ancient site there that eventually becomes the spot of a church. So that's the sort of most modern sort of making sacred of that place, is that it's even still in the last few hundred years, it's recognized as a sacred place and the church is put on top. So there's a real layering over so many thousands of years.
Okay. So I understand that a lot of these structures are in alignment with the sun, but is there anything on the earth that it's in alignment with? Are you aware of anything like that, ley lines or?
Yes, actually. What's incredible is that a lot of these sites align to one another, is that they lie on a line that you could trace around the earth. So, for example, the sites that lie on this line are sites like Machu Picchu in Peru, Easter Island. You have the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Yep. You also have the Nazca lines. Then you also have sites like Mohenjo-daro, which was in the Indus Valley. So these sites, and Angkor Wat in Cambodia, lie around the same line of the earth. You can trace a line right through all of them, within hardly an error of margin. And some of them are actually at symbolic degrees from one another. So this indicates again that these ancient sacred places, which remember have often been layered, are connected to one another, and that they were probably established by a very ancient seafaring culture or civilization of people, which again is very remarkable, because sites that may seem very disconnected, for example, Easter Island and the Great Pyramids, there's a connection there.
Wow. Any other connections besides being in a boat and being in the same line going around the globe? At that latitude, longitude, is that where the sun hits a certain way? I mean, does that have anything to do with the sun whatsoever? And maybe the curvature of the earth? I don't know. I'm just throwing things out there, because I'm looking for maybe like a deeper connection than just getting in the boat and it seems to, form a straight line going around the earth.
Yeah, that's right. So it encodes, people have realized that it encodes numbers of what is called precession. So there's a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, which is that over a very long cycle of time, the spring equinox sun will appear to rise in a different constellation.
Okay.
So that this cycle, it repeats over about a 25 to 26,000 year cycle. And there are different numbers as part of this cycle. And so some of them are 108, 72. So these are some of the degrees that these sites are separated from one another. And it's interesting that numbers like 108 are considered sacred in, for example, the Hindu tradition. Okay. So there's complex sort of astronomical observations and data that's encoded into a lot of these sites, and then also in how they were sort of aligned to one another, the positions they hold.
Okay. Are there any other stars that these structures are in alignment with, like, for example, Sirius or, I don't know, maybe just Orion in general?
Yeah, so Orion, the constellation of Orion is, again, you find is very common in terms of an alignment. So a lot of these sites will have as a dominant alignment to the winter, solstice or the equinox or whatever, but then also to the constellation of Orion. So obviously, famously, you have the Great Pyramids in Egypt, but you also have the Hopi mesas in North America. And their indigenous tradition talks about their encounter with a wisdom bringer too, called Masol, so who actually gave them sacred tablets to build their sites in alignment with different constellations. And incredibly, their mesas then aligned to Orion's belt. So you have this theme, again, repeating at many different ancient sites. In Easter Island, there are also alignments to Orion there. And Orion was seen as the embodiment of Osiris, again, this wisdom bringer. So you have all these different connections. Yeah, the story of this is just incredible, and it really has the ability to explain so much about our ancient past and our ancient history. Indeed. So the ancient religion of the sun was an amazing and dominant influence on so many ancient peoples and cultures, and gave rise to so many different ancient sites. And so the sun then became seen as the supreme symbol of divinity in so many different ancient cultures. Like you think of ancient Egypt, for example, you know, the sun adorned the entrance of all their temples. It was used as a symbol in the headdresses of all their ancient deities.
Yes.
And then also in the ancient Vedic religion of India, there's many different references to Brahman, who is the supreme being of the universe, as being likened to the sun, but also to our own higher being was seen as the sun. So the sun, you know, a lot of people, and this is what I would say, is a lot of people think of sun worship as a kind of bit of a silly thing, you know, like ancient peoples, well, they worship the sun. It's kind of almost cartoon-like, and almost poked fun at, like, you know, well, they were primitive, you know, we know better now because we know about the sun scientifically, and, you know, with those poor people, they just thought it was so important because, you know, if their crops didn't grow, they would starve and so on. But they're really underestimating what actually happened in the ancient past. And the ancient worship of the sun is not, at least for people who understood the sun in a profound and spiritual way, in its deeper sense, was not just a sort of a dumb worship, but it was a deep understanding of what the sun really is and how it relates to us personally and to our own higher being and our own quest and journey for enlightenment, and as the greatest source of light, sort of the source not only of the elements in the material world and the physical world. Even science admits that all the elements that we see around us that make up our physical world are actually created in the furnace of the stars. So you've probably heard people say that we are star stuff, you know.
Yes.
We are children of the stars, right? So definitely in a physical sense, that's true. But ancient peoples or ancient practitioners of religion of the sun understood it in a spiritual sense, because as above, so below, not only do the physical creation come from the stars, but also our own spiritual part also has its origin in the stars. And so there are ancient texts that speak about our home in the stars, that our own inner light comes from the higher light, the greater light of the sun and stars. And so that's why ancient people who practice the ancient religion of the sun came to call themselves the children of the sun. So they saw the sun as the origin of their own consciousness, their own inner light on a spiritual level. And the idea was to reunite with the sun, with our own inner sun, our own higher being. And that's what the path of the sun symbolized. So all the different solstices and equinoxes were stages in this great journey in returning to the sun.
Wow. Thank you, Lara, for that so much. It's just amazing. The sun, we go outside and it's right there and we take it for granted. And we
Exactly.
see any deeper. And these ancient civilizations, they saw it as a reminder to go within, like a reflection of what's inside. And every year they went through the cycle of death and rebirth of the ego, etc. And it's just beautiful how they lived and how they were so connected. And I thank you for showing up today and speaking on this so other people can be aware of the deeper meaning of the sun, the spiritual sun. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer. It's been really nice.
It's my pleasure. And I was wondering, is there anything that you want to get out to our viewers that is like a must for them to be aware of regarding the sun?
I would say don't leave it as something in the ancient past. Bring it to your own life and experience these things for yourself. So even if you can just do it in a small way, really bring it into your life. And because, like I said, it's one thing to understand it on an intellectual level, but it's something else to actually feel it. So it's something that happens beyond the mind. You actually feel something, and that's what many ancient people were actually doing, is that they could feel and sense things that perhaps we've reduced to sort of complex equations and mathematics and scientific thinking, which has its place, but so does that intuitive sense and that intuitive feeling, and being able to be in nature and really sense the deeper spiritual side of it, and to actually connect in with it by being conscious and aware, and having that understanding of the principles of how the sun relates to us on a spiritual level.
Thank you for that. And I'd like to show our viewers, this is the book that you wrote with your husband. And so if you want to learn a little bit more about the equinoxes and the solstices, that's the book to get. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today and for checking in with Lara. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you again, Lara.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye, everybody.